Welcome again to the American Zarathustra channel. It is my pleasure today to have a very, very special guest, one of my favorite musicians in the White Art Collective, Hiraeth. Say hello, Hiraeth. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. It's an
Yeah,
honor.
we're so excited to have you involved in the Imperium Art discussion. Let me quickly introduce. We have Tyler Hamilton, the editor of RADIX and RADIX Journal and host of EBL. How are you today, Tyler?
Doing well. Thanks for asking.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Nullus, the host of Conversations with the Wind, every other Sunday on the White Art Collective D Live channel. How you doing, Nullus?
I'm all right. Thank you very much.
Beauty, beauty. So this is another part of the series of discussions that we're doing weekly on the concept of Imperium Art. And so if you're new to this concept, maybe this is your first time entering this discussion, talking a little bit about it, I think we want to back up a little bit and kind of ask, what is the goal of the dissident right? And I think it's just in simple terms, we could say to stop white genocide. And there's many, many more things you could say on top of that, but that's one of the cornerstones of the dissident right. The next question is, well, how do you do that? How do you stop white genocide? Well, I believe through a global racial awakening, a kind of European imperium, going from a diaspora to an imperium, a mass awakening. And then that topic is enormous too. That's a huge can of worms. So then the question following that would be, well, then how do you wake up Europeans? So my answer would be to create Imperium Art, a kind of an art culture that reflects people who are woke in this sense, and that are, we're all doing things in the dissident right, on the internet, in our various spheres, in real life in some cases, but we lack political power. So the question comes down to, well, what is our message? What is the thing that we're doing and saying, and how can we bring that across? And so that's where we've come up with this idea of Imperium Art. So I wanted today, since Hiraeth is our special guest, we kind of came up with some questions for her. I guess very quickly, Hiraeth, maybe you want to give us your first impressions about how do you see Imperium Art? What is it about this discussion that interests you?
Well, gosh, there's like so many things that I could say, because ever since I watched those videos or listened to you guys talk about it, it was like my mind's been kind of zooming around in this process, because there's so many, it's very layered and there's a lot to it, and it's something that I don't even know if it's going to be possible to clearly define it, because, well, you can't, if you're talking about like a reawakening of the biospirit or a European soul kind of thing, you can't define that. Like, there's no way to possibly define such a thing, because we are it. So it's more of like getting back in touch with our sense of self and knowing who we are, and then being able to, survive based on that, So when you say things like the dissident right goal is to stop white genocide, I agree, but at the same time, my only issue with putting it that way is that it puts us in a like a victim standpoint. And I think that the reason why this whole genocide is happening, or the reason why, is because we pretty much lost our will to exist. Like, we feel like we don't have a right to exist anymore, and we're losing it, our will to survive is like diminishing greatly. And that's like insane, because every living thing on the planet has this instinctive will to survive, to carry on, and keep existing. And so, like, what is it that we've lost that's made this happen? Like, how did we get here? And so these are all the questions that have popped in my mind since I first heard the very first episode you guys did on this topic. And I mean, the one thing that I can come to, the conclusion I come to is we've greatly lost our ability to self-reflect, and on a multiple levels, like a racial level, ethnic level, individual level. And this is something that we've been we've always been very, very good at. Like it's reflected in our art and our architecture, our literature, and our stories throughout our history. Like for instance, Greek, Norse, and Roman mythology, and we've always been able to self-reflect and like accurately assess who we are and understand ourselves, and both good and bad aspects. And the thing about that is, if you know where your weaknesses are, then it's going to be a lot harder for an enemy to take advantage of those weaknesses. You know what I mean?
Well done. Well said. Yeah.
So,
Indeed.
the first thing that comes to mind, or one of the main stories, is the story of Narcissus, in Greek mythology. And it's almost like that was a warning of, we have like the potential to lose ourselves in this sort of way. So, and there's so many different examples of that sort of thing throughout our mythology. But anyways, yeah.
That's actually, you just really inspired me to create a new work of art based on Narcissus, but within the context of Imperium Art, and how perhaps, well, one of my angles, and I'm sure many other people would agree, is how our cultural and historic narrative has been usurped or stolen and sold back to us as in these falsehoods. That's a massive topic, and we know there's a certain tribe behind that, controlling the media, the entertainment, academics. So, I think that it seems to me that, the arts have a way of kind of bypassing that, arts that are coming straight from us. So that's it's great to hear that you're interested, and we're extremely glad to kind of bring you into this and embrace your ideas and your criticisms. This is something we have a lot of conversations each week offline or through texts, etc., where many people are coming to us that want to talk about this, get involved in this, but everyone kind of has a sort of a little laundry list of, well, these are the things I see wrong with it. And we are begging you to bring those critiques and questions to us so that we can work them through and figure them out together. So that's a really key aspect, and we appreciate that. So one thing I wanted to say, first of all, I'm very impressed that you were able to get Kai Moros for an interview on the White Art Collective. Did he influence your ideas in a way that connect to Imperium Art in any way? Hiraeth?
Yeah, actually he did. Well, I mean, he more of like reaffirmed what I kind of had already felt, in a way. And one thing about it is that, well, it's such a big idea, and I think that you can't really take away the importance of ethnic culture and tradition, and that's like a smaller scale of the big things. So they were talking about like macrocosms and microcosms here. So as long as like the concept of Imperium Art wouldn't diminish the importance of stuff like that, like preserving ethnic cultural identity through art and music and literature and stuff, then I think it could be a really good way to help amplify our signal and really have an impact just worldwide. But what Kai Mura specifically would influence me on is the fact that I think he would also say that it needs to be relatable. Like, so whatever you create under this umbrella term of Imperium Art, it needs to be relatable to, to multiple aspects of the Europeans' collective soul or biospirit. And the way that, it's going to be relatable is people are going to have to be able to see themselves in that work, so they have to feel connected to it.
Beautifully said. I rudely forgot to ask the other gentleman here if they wanted to respond to some of the things that you were saying. Tyler, do you have any comments or any thoughts on Hiraeth's ideas?
Yeah, very well said. I'll chime in with my 2 cents. I think when it comes to defining Imperium Art, it's not so much that we need a grandiose, all-encompassing definition, because we're still essentially laying the foundations. But I think in that sense, then, the foundations are pretty much already present in the sense of what you both said, and that we're trying to affect a globally racial consciousness awakening that's more in tune with our spirit of who we are, which is something that we've lost. And I think then in that sense, it's largely a participatory activity where the actual aesthetic creation process going into it is as much going to define what that definition, that foundation will be going forward, rather than trying to lay the foundation entirely first. That what that is going to mean is going to come over time as the interplay between thinkers and artists starts to come together, and there's mutual interaction going on. So I would agree with that there. I would also say I do take slight issue as well with the definition of the dissident right as stop white genocide, which I think is obviously, of course, a key component. I agree with that, but I would also say that the very system that we have now in place that's degraded the European spirit to such a point is largely our own creation, in the sense that it doesn't leave it open to parasites. It actually relies on these parasites in order to function. And so I think if to stop it is simply not good enough. It has to be an understanding of creating a new horizon of meaning or a new political and economic system that would actually put the stopgap on any further subversion, in the sense that it doesn't just leave it open, but it will preclude even the need to rely on it when it comes to finance. So that's the caveat I would add to that there.
Very good. Nullus, would you like to join us?
Yes, I actually can't really add much to everything that was said, but I will maybe supplement it with the idea of the warrior ethos that I think that ties in with the victimization mentality, which we should and must find a way to shake. Because the most important part of introspection is coming to terms with who you are, realizing your own weaknesses, mistakes, and then coming to terms with the external forces that are putting pressure onto you, and then finding a solution and moving forward with that. And I think the warrior ethos is a very important aspect of this, at least, especially from an artistic point of view, but I would say even from a personal point of view. And I think that through Imperium Art, we can capture this. I'm not going to say define it clearly, because again, as Tyler accurately said, we're still on the ground floor, in the basement actually, of this whole concept. So we're laying foundations here. We're trying to conceptualize something that hopefully will have significantly more meaning down the road. Suffice it to say, these concepts, these ideas of introspection as opposed to victimization, identifying the proper way of identifying the external pressures, the negative influences, the parasitic influences, and dealing with it accordingly, is also a part of Imperium Art in the way that we express ourselves artistically, in the way that we express ourselves with each other. And maybe I would add that the way I understand Imperium Art, for the moment at least, and how I try to visualize it in my mind, is almost like this existential plane plane where you can have people of various different cultural and different ethnic backgrounds congregate in this Imperium, in this existential reality, and find ways to draw inspiration from each other, to learn from each other, and grow through that learning. And I think that's pretty much where I would stop at the moment.
Hiraeth, would you like to respond to any of that? Hiraeth?
I mean, I think we're all pretty much on board on some level or another. So.
Okay. So Francis Parker Yockey wrote a book, Imperium, and I understand you've read his work. How might his ideas have informed your ideas, and how does all of this relate to Imperium Art? Hiraeth?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a really big question. Yes, I've read all of his work that I could get my hands on actually about a few years ago. So it's been a few years, but I did read it and I really enjoyed it, and it influenced me a lot because he saw things and defined things from a completely different perspective than you see today in the material world. And so he saw culture as like an organism. And I know he was really influenced by Oswald Spengler, which I didn't actually read his book Decline of the West, but I do know that he was influenced by him. And I guess all of his work has influenced my thoughts to some extent. I'm not really sure about I guess it's influenced my art or my music too,
Mm.
because I put my thought and my energy into that. But I liked the way he defined things, and it was during a time where things didn't make a lot of sense to me. I was trying to, I was going down those rabbit holes and trying
Yeah,
to make sense of the world.
of course.
Want to like start to, I guess, become more aware of what the way things actually are, and instead of what you were taught
Hmm.
growing up and stuff. It's I was like searching for truth. And so when I came across his book, it really put things into perspective for me on so many different levels.
Hmm.
And I think that it will definitely would apply here to Imperium Art. Um, I mean, I think the main thing is like how to best keep it so where we wouldn't be opening ourselves up to like cultural, or what he would call culture pathology, and parasitism. He said culture retardation, for instance, which is what
Hmm.
he would have defined America as, which is
Yeah.
very accurate in my opinion.
Okay.
And culture distortion, which, is pretty much what the subverters would do, I guess. They would distort things.
Hmm.
Um, and so the best thing that I could think of here is how to apply this is how could we do this in a level where it wouldn't like uproot us to some, or create more identity loss in some other way that could potentially open us up to some of these things, to more subversion and things like that. So and my only conclusion for that would to be to work on self-reflection on just about every level that you can, all the
Mm.
way down to the microcosm of the individual self,
Mm. Powerful. Very, very, very
So
good insights. Let me just first get Nullus and Tyler's impressions of what you said. And I have a really important question regarding music for you. So, Nullus, would you like to respond to that?
Well, absolutely, and this ties into a conversation I think an ongoing conversation that we have within the White Art Collective about the various styles of music that are representative in the popular culture, and then the question arises, which of these genres are quote unquote, I'm going to use the word acceptable for lack of a better term,
Hmm.
but I would say maybe consistent with the Imperium art concept, consistent with our traditions, consistent with what comes naturally for us. So the idea of rap music comes to play. That and on Twitter I created this whole ruckus by criticizing rap music for what it is, at least the
Hmm.
way I see it.
Hmm.
And I was surprised by the responses I got, and I think that that's where I want to tie into this whole notion that a lot of people seem to be very defensive of the art, of the genre,
Hmm.
and they start rationalizing the reason and the need to use that particular genre, in
Hmm.
spite of the fact that the genre itself was essentially created as an anti-white
Yeah,
genre.
I agree.
There's no other way of defining it, in my opinion, at
Exactly.
least.
Exactly.
And so it was very fascinating for me to see the responses and the way people are reacting to it. And another aspect comes to mind. And again, this ties into this whole question of somewhat, you could say, the morality question of can an immoral artist create a masterpiece? And so that's a difficult question often, because you'll have these rock stars, these musicians
Mm.
that'll play beautiful songs, but then you look at their private lives and it's just a train wreck. So you don't even understand how someone like that can create so much beauty. And then you also have to ask yourself, is this something that we should be supporting? Are we only looking at it through the aesthetic value? Are we saying that the aesthetic value can create a transcendental experience for us or not? Or do we also want to look at the artist for who they are? So these are important questions, I think, and I think it all ties into this the devolution, so to speak, of the current popular culture, the trajectory that we're heading, so to speak.
That ties into what Hiraeth was saying, discussing Yaki's ideas of cultures as organisms, cultural distortion, cultural retardation. And obviously we could spin off on a massive tangent, and maybe should do a whole, or I believe we will have to do a whole show on that.
And Donald, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add one thing about hip hop and rap music. There's another element to it that's not as obvious. Well, it is obvious, but it's not as direct. Well, maybe that's even wrong. It is direct. But what it does is it basically changes the way people speak. It changes language in the way people relate to each other. It changes the way people dress. It changes the way people treat each other.
Yeah.
So there's a huge cultural impact here, and none of it is positive, in my opinion.
No, not at all. This goes, there you go, cultural distortion. And I would just do a quick sidebar. Who owns the hip hop industry? Who's at the top of the corporate chain there? That's another discussion. So Tyler, what are your thoughts on Yaki and Hiraeth's impressions on all this?
Well, I hate to greatly disappoint, but I've actually not read that much Yaki at all, aside from the fact that I usually get compared to him in a negative light.
Oh,
like, oh, you're
wow. Wow.
So that's my only familiarity. So I hate to disappoint on that angle, but I will comment on her comments, though. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, go for it.
All right, yeah. I do think it's important what Hiraeth said, though, about the need to retain a certain amount of critical thinking and self-reflection when it comes to the projects we're engaged in the sense that we don't lose sight of who we are or ethnic particularities or dissolving our uniqueness into like a grand imperial vision, which does run the risk of missing our own particularities in that regard. I think that's important as well. I would counterpose that with, I think one of the great ways to actually maintain the self-critical dimension is instead of a constant state of introspection, is to balance it out with being a zealot. Now, I know that might sound kind of paradoxical to say the best way to remain self-critical is to become a zealot. But the sense in which I mean this is that if you are so overwhelmingly committed to reawakening the European spirit and to be true to your ancestors and where you came from and the various senses that motivated and guided them, then concerns about, for example, purity spiraling or not saying the right thing that will appeal to the people that agree with you, or risking going against the grain sometimes with what you feel that you might have to say is important and critical, is that if you have a zealot's perspective of everything that you're doing is for the betterment of awakening the spirit, then all self-dimension and self-critical thinking will be necessarily balanced out with the right intention behind it, to the point that you no longer care about trying to tone your language so you don't, offend your brothers and sisters. You're speaking with truth. And I think that speaking with truth is really the greatest thing that shines a light on what your own intentions are and will naturally correct the course should you risk falling off of it.
So based on our conversation so far, one of the key questions that I'm kind of gleaning off of this is, how do you create a white awakening while maintaining ethnic diversity? So this is just a theme that keeps coming up and is obviously central and critical. But I would also say that it's this kind of conundrum. It seems like a riddle in a sense. And my first impressions to that, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, is in a sense the old phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That I'll give you an example. I have a very, very close friend. He's Italian American, and we're in a restaurant and we're talking white identity politics, and he says, "Oh, I'm not white." And then I said, "Yes, you are." And then here we go, and then we're off to the races. And I put it to him, I said, if a person of color walks into this restaurant right now and shoots up the place, when they come to you, are they going to stop and say, "Oh, don't shoot him, he's white," or "He's not white"? dramatic pause, right? You see where I'm going. It's not just how we define ourselves, it's how we're defined by every other non-white, cultures in the world. So I'm kind of, this is ham-fisted here. It's not very eloquent the way I'm putting these things, but they matter. I think that those are the initial aspects of it. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Hiraeth, would you like to start? Got a little lag there.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I guess I'd actually like to speak to what Tyler said, if that's all right.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, because when I talk about self-reflection, I guess I want to clarify that I don't mean like just sitting there and looking inward all the time and not having any action that goes with that. I feel like Imperium Art, if done correctly, then it would be a tool you would self-reflect through that. So it is about honesty, and like no matter what we do, it should be about honesty. But I feel like to do that, we have to know who we are, and we have to be honest about who we are, both good and bad, and we have to look inward some for that too, even as individuals. So it can be on an individual level, and then a family level, and then a community level, and then ethnically and racially. So it kind of just works its way up, and there's so many different levels of this. But I think every level is important, and I'm not an individualist, so but I'm just thinking of like, well, if you're posing that question of what can I personally do to help or contribute in some way, and I think that definitely having that sense of self-reflection is going to help, because there's a lot of ego, especially in our community, but I mean, just in the world in general, but in our community, I've noticed it more and more. And I think a lot of that kind of comes from not being able to just self-assess, and just reflect just like sit back for a second and be like, okay, could I potentially see where this person's coming from? And it just causes all these problems because people lash out and they want to see every problem from coming from the world without themselves, instead of something that could be a problem that we have within it. And I mean this more on like a cultural organism kind of level, but it can be broken all the way down into the individual level as well. So it's just, if you could see those correlations, Does that make any sense?
Yeah, actually, what
Okay.
it's the fascinating thing about it is, I'm from my perspective, Imperium Art actually places race at the center, and ethnicity, then nation, community, family, and self as kind of the outer circle. I don't know if that's the opposite of how you're looking at it, but that's the
No,
idea.
I would see race as the biggest umbrella of
Okay.
it. The biggest, that would be the macrocosm of what I'm talking about. And then, inside of that big bubble of race, you would have
Yeah.
ethnicities
Okay.
and families and local communities, individual self, that sort of thing.
I don't think Nullus has had a chance to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could define race as the Imperium in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say that is the Imperium, and in a sense it is.
Yeah.
But it's more than that. It's also the broader community. It's the sense of the extended family. The ethnicities, the various nations are the more inner families, and then you have the extended families. And there are ways to go about this. There's a lot of discussion now on this, which I think is wonderful. And I think that there are different perspectives to it, which is also good, so that we can try to hash it out. Getting back to the introspection, and also what Tyler was saying about being zealous in you and representing truth, I think this ties into this whole concept that I'm trying to, and hopefully it resonates well, this concept of the warrior poet that I wrote about in the essay, that embraces the full spectrum, the full emotional spectrum. So you, as an artist, you can't deny the violence and the rage. You can't deny the hurt. You can't deny the longing for nation or for something that you feel that you've lost or is disintegrating in front of you. So there are many emotions going on, and I think that there's a point where you have to temper this with your discipline, with your conviction, and that's where you are zealous, your conviction and truth. and your commitment to that conviction and truth. So I think that all ties into everything that we're trying to achieve. And I think as an artist, the warrior poet ethos could apply to any one of these artists. So it's not just for poets or for people who are in literature. It applies to anyone. And I think that this is also an important message, that introspection is not, as Hiraeth correctly said, it's not wallowing in sorrow, so to speak, but it is identifying things. It's understanding things around you and how it relates to you. So all of these tie together, and they do translate through your art, and then you have to contextualize it within the Imperium of who you are.
So Hiraeth, you've read Nullus's essay on Imperium Art?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could share your impressions of that with the audience.
Gosh, I mean, it was a lot. It was a lot to chew on, and I really enjoyed it. You can definitely tell that Nullus is coming from the literary standpoint, because that is his craft. It's very obvious that is his craft because he's so good at it. But yeah, so I guess speaking to that, like to what he was talking about in his essay about nihilism and immorality, I was thinking that Imperium Art could definitely be the cure for that, in a sense that it is the perfect tool to use for honest self-reflection, and that would be like self-reflection through action in this way of, you're using art as your tool for that, So.
So Tyler, did you want to chime in? I guess he's having some scotch at the moment.
No, my computer froze for a second when I went to unmute myself. Just a quick, I didn't mean to misrepresent you there, Hiraeth. I just meant when self-reflection isn't counterbalanced by zealous commitment, it can running the risk of leading to stagnation. No, I didn't mean that.
Right, yeah. Nobody wants to be stagnant.
Yeah, but it does happen, right? I mean,
yeah, definitely. I mean, if you sit and ponder, you could ponder your life away if you just sit and think long enough, Well, so I think there is a balance, absolutely. So you didn't misrepresent me. I just wanted to. It did make me want to clarify. So.
Oh no, fair enough. Yeah, I just mean like another example of that is like you often see a lot of spirals of blackpilling when we reflect so much on how negative our current trajectory is that it suddenly becomes like a necessity that we have to just ride the tiger out and then hope that we could somehow survive in the long run. It ends up turning into like a certain narrative where it becomes almost like just a given. It's just going to happen. There's no sense of rupture or event or or some kind of thinking that's balanced by like a revelatory or religious aspect, for example, that would rupture this sense of time with another sense of time.
Right.
So I think we agree entirely. But
honestly, though, I kind of feel like a lot of that does come from lack of introspection, though, because you're like, you get black-pilled about the state of things and the state of the world and everything that's without the, outside of the self, and not even just the individual self, but you could say the collective self as well, because you could consider your individual self to be part of that collective self. So it's all connected in my point of view. And I don't know, when there's a lack of introspection, I think that leads to a lot of black-pilled mentality and thinking. So I think introspection helps, but I mean, that definitely needs to come with action. I agree. Like, you can't just sit there and think all the time. You have to actually do something with those thoughts and with that knowledge that whatever you end up coming to the conclusion of.
Oh yeah, for sure. I agree with that. I think the main difference with us is I tend to understand the way in which the mind thinks about the world and thinks about itself is through the images that are given to us by this culture, because the way that we used to think about meaning was set up against a certain horizon where we could understand and place things and place objects and place our relationships with others and our community. And now that that's gone, so what can often happen is, like, you look at a lot of art, for example, they're reflecting on the artist's inner state, right? But what ends up coming out is largely disjointed, pastiches with no meaning, because the sense of meaning where they derive their mind from has been so removed that introspection can often lead to the same consequences we're trying to avoid. But I think we agree entirely. I'm just coming at it from a bit of a different angle there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add very quickly that I think from an artistic point of view, the word catharsis is what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to send a message, and even if your message is just to use the rhetorical tool where you're trying to insult your audience or you're trying to blackpill your audience, you still have to provide some kind of a cathartic experience, some kind of a cleansing experience in the process. Because if you're just going to leave them in the dark, then it's going to have a negative impact, and you're going to have the reverse impact and resonance from the receivers.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that Imperium Art is very much about moralizing and empowering our people as well. This dovetails really nicely into my next question. For those of you listening that don't know Hiraeth, her music is astounding. It's extremely powerful, beautiful. I just cannot say enough about it. And at the end of the show, she'll give you her link or etc. But my question for her is really based on your understanding of Imperium Art, Hiraeth. How could that be a guide to musicians, or what would your advice be, to connect these two realms? Or, I mean, I'm trying to feel this out. I'm a visual artist and a musician, but for me, in the visual arts, this is sort of an easy question, and because of symbolisms and art conventions, etc. But what about in music? Where do you how do you see the music that you're doing, or music of the White Art Collective? How could that plug into Imperium Art?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate that. It means a lot, first off. But that's a very big question. I mean, honestly, when I started writing music, my main rule for myself was that no matter what I'm doing, it needs to be honest. Like whatever I'm doing, it has to be completely honest, 100%. I have to be feeling it in that way. And then in hope that maybe if somebody hears it, because I didn't know at the time if anybody would, but that maybe one person might hear it and it'll like resonate with them because maybe they will have gone through something or they can relate in some way and it just speaks to them and they're just like, yes, this person gets it, because that's how music's been for me throughout my whole life. It's like the music that I connect with, I really connect with.
Sure.
And so as far as like how people could create some music for Imperium, I would just say like know yourself and be honest with yourself in a sense to where you could connect with others in that way, because like I was explaining before, I don't think the biospirit or the European soul is something that can be just so clear cut, easily defined, because there's so many different aspects of it because of our different countries and all sorts of things. So you're gonna have different sounds, you're gonna have different types of music, and it's all gonna speak to different people within this realm, so and that's important to have. I think it's important to have all those different aspects of it, instead of just having like it diluted and died down in this, like it's just this one thing, you know what I mean? Like it's this one thing that's all the same, so it's gotta have different, so it's gotta appeal to different people because it comes down to that relatability issue. What I find relatable, someone in some other European country might not find relatable at all,
But your music it really, really speaks to white identity politics. You're very, very aware of, and most all the topics that you talk about in your music have something to do with whiteness, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I feel that it's astounding for starters, just on its own merits. But then I feel like it really could be a model, frankly, for a lot of musicians who are interested in pursuing Imperium Art. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Gosh, thank you. I don't know. It's hard to like assess your own work, because
True.
I don't know, like I couldn't even categorize. I was like, I don't even know what genre I am, so I just made up one because I wasn't sure. So
Well, let's get the other guy's impression on this. Tyler, would you like to chime in? I know you know a few things about music.
Well, first thing I'll say is Hiraeth's music's great. If anyone in the audience hasn't heard it, they should run and listen to it. as soon as this ends.
Mhm.
No,
Thank
what was
you.
the yeah, you're
I'll
welcome.
put a link. I'll put a link below for sure.
What was the exact question about music? Because you also asked an earlier question about, well, our position if, white Imperium takes off, but we have these multi-ethnic societies to run, how that would work as well. So I
You
kind of
could
want to answer
under
that one.
that. Go for it. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, just because I don't want to miss the opportunity to speak on this.
That's
But
for sure. For sure, it's important.
have you seen that movie, The Gentleman, the Guy Ritchie movie?
Give me some details. I'm not sure if I have or not. What happens in the story?
Well, it's a recent movie with Matthew McConaughey in it, and the reason I'm talking about this movie is because it perfectly encapsulates the absence of the white man from his authoritative position in the world. And so the
Mhm.
premise of that movie is that he's basically runs a weed empire, and then he decides to retire one day, and then all of a suddenly, all these various ethnic groups are at each other's throats to try and control the empire. Meanwhile, a Jewish guy with the
Mhm.
literal Mossad on his side as enforcers try to work the white man out of that position. And
Mhm.
so the whole premise of the movie is that the well-dressed white man is actually the cool authoritative figure that can bring all these various ethnic minorities into line and get rid of the negative subversive influence. If you watch the movie, it's incredibly so over the top how on our side it is. But the reason I reference that is because when it comes to, if say that we have power and it's an imperium, and then we still have to deal with the reality of the fact of demographics before repatriation and things of the sort, that you have to run a multi-ethnic empire in that sense. And
Mhm.
so I think the responsibility of Europeans is always to use the state and creative and dynamic authority to bring these groups together outside of resentment in such a fashion that the current way that very real racial tendencies are weaponized by the interests of capital would be something that we could bring to heel. And that's very much a part of actually who we are. And it always has been throughout our history. The white man's burden is a very real thing.
Oh yeah.
So I don't think it's, if it done right, it's not something that'll run the risk of forgetting who we are. In fact, it's very much a part of who we are.
Mhm.
So I think in that very process, we're realizing ourselves. But now, what was the question about music again?
Essentially, it's what? How would we? How do I say? For Hiraeth, this was kind of a musician's question. That how would you advise musicians to make music that could be called Imperium art? How would you connect music to that, to Imperium art?
Well, that's a hard question, but because
Indeed,
I don't
indeed.
make music myself, but I think that music plays such a strong role in self-understanding for us and the community that there's generally two dimensions for it, right? You have music, which could, what you might then say is high art, for example, where it's like something you see in a conservatory, but then it could be like something which is more participatory in the sense of like a metal concert, right? Where there's a lot of strong energy and you kind of lose yourself in the crowd and in the music.
In the
And so
mosh
I
pit.
think, yeah, and I think in that sense, then to talk about creating music for the Imperium is to do so in such a way that it's participatory and the listener is someone who's supposed to lose their sense of self and be pulled up into this higher reality of something that connects us more than um, small interests like feeding and sex and things like that. And so I think what you see in like a lot of black metal, for example, is bands like Infernal War and Truppensturm and stuff like this, as they present like a very strong martial image that the very act of listening to it draws you into this participatory state of power and domination,
Mhm.
right? Which is, of course, those don't have to be the messages you're trying to get across, but nonetheless, is the sense of participation that comes out of embodying those images and drawing the listener into it is something that needs to be created. It's essentially bringing them into an empathetic state where they lose their sense of themselves as purely individuals in the soul crushing system, and helps them embody this higher reality so that when they carry out their day-to-day lives, they inhabit this sense of self as removed and transcending the petty consumerism that inhabits our life at the present.
Hmm. Hmm. Consumerism is definitely the enemy of Imperium Art, and the idea of making it some kind of corporate McDonald's style music that all sounds the same, similar to what hip hop seems to be to me today. Nullus, do you have any comments on music and Imperium Art?
Yes, I think there are several layers to consider when questioning, when asking the question about how one identifies with music in an Imperium context. You'll have symbolisms. For example, you'll have Nordic or Norse themes in a song, and a certain segment of the European, let's just say the cultural aspect of it. Some people will resonate with that more than other people. An Italian might not resonate with the Viking theme as much as with a Roman theme, for example.
Right.
So we have to take that aspect into consideration. With that said, there's also a genre aspect to consider, and as both Hiraeth and I have to say, Tyler is actually pronouncing Hiraeth a lot better than we are.
Is that correct?
I think so.
Really?
But
I thought I was butchering
I
it.
thought it was Hiraeth.
I don't know. I'm it just sounds good.
I say my own name wrong. It's technically like Hiraeth or something.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's all.
So,
But I don't say it that. I say Hiraeth. So.
we'll all take Welsh courses.
There you go.
Right.
So getting back to what I'm saying is that you do have differences in associating with the various cultural elements of a song. Depending on what part of Europe you're from. Somebody from Portugal will resonate differently to certain symbolisms than somebody from Poland. So it goes on and on and on like that. But then you also have the genre aspect. And I think that's what both Hiraeth and Tyler touched upon, where you'll have a metal, like a metal genre that's more martial. And then it doesn't really matter as much it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much what the cultural symbolism is as much as the message, and people are resonating with that martial message. Or you'll have a folk song that has more of an earthy kind of tone to it, and people will resonate with that because they like folk music, and so they will listen to folk music from all over Europe because they just like folk music. So there are many different types of ways to associate, and I think that's going to be a very interesting challenge for Imperium Art, is to not force a particular model on anyone, but just let it grow organically. Let people find their space within this Imperium so that they can associate with what comes closest to them, what resonates to them. What I think we should be focused on, and again, it's a work in progress, but I think we should be focused more on context and how we're trying to elevate the message itself. So I would say that, and I do want to make a side comment that, Donald, we have to talk about literature and poetry, especially in Imperium Art. But we'll talk about that on another, we'll address that separately, because there you'll have other challenges. We don't have to address this now.
Certainly.
But I think that's definitely good for an upcoming show or an upcoming stream.
Discussions I've had with Kai Moros, he's very, very interested in design and architecture, and those would be the two things that he feels are extremely important. So, there's still so much more to talk about, and each week when I put these out, more and more people come into this discussion. It's very exciting. So there's really quite a lot to cover. And I'm extremely grateful for all of you being involved with this together. I think each time we come together, this Imperium Art grows and grows, and it gets clearer and stronger, and it's going to help us serve those purposes that I was talking about at the beginning of the show. So we do want to wrap it up now, though. So I did want to ask Hiraeth if she would tell us her website address, or where people can go and listen to her amazing music.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to say I do agree with what you said about consumerism being the enemy or the opposing side to Imperium Art, because that does promote a lot of individualist, ego-driven kind of out for yourself mentality. But you can find me at Hiraeth Music on YouTube. If you just search Hiraeth Music, that'll come up. And if you go to like the About page, it should have all of the other links in there. So I'll just leave it at that. Make it easy.
Okay. Hiraeth, just for people listening. So, Nullus, where can people find you? What's your web address?
You can find me on www.abnormocracy.com. That's abnormal democracy, abnormocracy.com.
And I'll put a link below as well. Tyler, how about you?
EBL is on NPI Radix YouTube channel, and my personal YouTube channel is Samster Whitnat, which is the same as Twitter, and then the Radix Journal.
Fantastic. And again, thank you so much for joining us. You guys have a great night, and we'll see you next time around.
Thank you.